Hi, I'm Daniel Fisher here at Sweetwater, and today we are going to take the long-awaited deep dive into the Moog Matriarch semi-modular analog synthesizer. So I've thought a lot about how to do this deep dive video, and my main goal is to keep it interesting. I don't want it to get bloated. I don't want it to just be a reading of the owner's manual page by page. So I'm going to just show you basic ideas for each of the sections, and then to really help shorten this, I'm going to point you to other videos I've made called SYNTH CLIPS, where it shows specifically how that point that I'm trying to show is done, not just on this synth, but on other synths, so you get a generalized idea how that works. So the very first thing that we've got to do is you've got to update this to the latest operating system. Unless you just bought it yesterday, assume that you don't have the latest operating system. It's easy to do. Just get the latest operating system, go to moogmusic.com, and then go to Matriarch and Downloads and go get it. Currently it's 1.2.3, but I imagine that's going to be going up soon anyway. So keep an eye on that. And then after you've gone to Moog Music to get your firmware downloaded, then go to Sweetwater, and we're going to show you how to get to an article called Moog Matriarch Firmware and Calibration Update. And that will, one, set all of the oscillators and filters to perfect calibration and tracking, and then there's another procedure which sets the major knobs, minimum, max, and center, including the pitch and mod wheel, and makes those perfect. So that's just a brilliant thing to do. So do all that before we get to the next stuff, because if you don't, there will be things I'm talking about that might not exist on your system, and you're going to want this thing perfectly calibrated too. So we'll start with the oscillators, because that's where everything starts sonically. There are 4 oscillators in the Moog Matriarch. There's really 5 if you use the modulation oscillator, because it can be driven into audible frequency. But you got your 4 oscillators, and of course you can have them in unison. You could also have them slightly detuned. You could have them at different pitches, or if you change your paraphony mode from 1 voice to 4 voice, you could actually play up to 4 note chords with 1 oscillator going to each of the notes in the chords. So for this example right now, I'm using a VCA mode thrown all the way to amp envelope so that you're not hearing any sound until you press a key, as opposed to drone, which is going to be on all the time. I'm going to turn multi-trigger on just to keep things easy. And I have, on my mixer, I have all of the oscillators off except for oscillator 1. And the mixer is not only a mixer, but when you turn the oscillator levels above 12 o'clock, you're also starting to drive that mixer into distortion in a very musical way. And so just always be aware of whether you want that effect or not. So right now, like I said, I have oscillator 1 on and 2, 3, and 4 off. And there it is. I got my filter open nice and wide. And we can do obviously the different octaves. And you can do octaves here as well. So clearly you can go from above and below the range of human hearing, which is super. And obviously that can have your 4 wave shapes. And when you're in square or pulse, you can modulate the pulse width like that and get a different sound, and moving that in real time is a great way to add life to your oscillators, especially when only 1 oscillator per note is being used when you're in the 4 voice mode. So here I have a square wave listed, and I can use the modulation section to do it. I'll start with a sine wave, and I'm going to turn the pulse width amount up. And remember that anything you do with these knobs does nothing until you move the mod wheel up. So here we go. And at first it sounds like vibrato, but it's really not. It's really changing the pulse width. And it's a very beautiful sound. And so the beauty of it is we're getting the fatness you would expect from 2 oscillators layered, but we're only using one oscillator. And again, that's very important when you're using 4-voice mode. But you can use other sources to modulate pulse width modulation, other than this modulation over here. And the reason you might not want to use this one is this has lots of complex features that you might want to use for something else, whereas pulse width modulation, a lot of times it's something simple. So one idea, you use this LFO over here, triangle out. And if I just take that right into pulse width modulation in of oscillator 1, it should just do it. And right away, again, we've got that beautiful sound that almost sounds like multiple oscillators detuned, which is a great sound. So how can we do it to more than one of the oscillators? Well, that's where a utility comes in, a MULT. So instead of going there, I could go in, and here's a little trick I always do. When I'm using a MULT with 4 jacks, I always use the lower left to be my input, and then these 3 is my output. The beauty of that is that when you're troubleshooting and you look down, you always know which one's the source and which ones are the outputs. So there's my input. Now I'll take another cable and go to the pulse within, which works. But now I'm going to listen to oscillator 2, and I'm going to put one in there. And since I have one more out on my MULT, I'm going to go into the pulse width modulation for number 3. And now when I turn up the 3 oscillators, got a really nice fat sound. I could change the rate. So now maybe you feel like the amount of pulse width modulation is too much, or you want real-time control over that. Well, that's what one of these attenuators can be used for. And so what you do is, instead of coming out of triangle out, you come out of attenuator out, and then you take a cable from triangle out to the attenuator in, and now I can go from this to where it's too much, back down to an amount that's not too much. And because this is a special kind of attenuator called an inverting attenuator or attenuverter, basically what it means, instead of going all the way left to be 0, you go to 12 o'clock to be 0, and everything you go clockwise is going to add the amount. It's going to multiply against your input. And then when you go left of 12 o'clock counterclockwise, you're going to also increase the depth, but the signal will be inverted upside down. So it'll change the shape upside down, or whatever it is that's going into it. So I'm going to start at 0 and then turn it up. And always be conscious when you're doing vibratos, when you're doing stereo delay time modulation, and when you're doing pulse width modulation, that often the speed that you're modulating it will dictate how much attenuation you should or should not use. So when you change the rate, you always have to go back and change the depth to make it the way that you like. Very powerful. I could also use, instead of an LFO to change the pulse width, I could use an envelope. I could use filter. Now, to make sure that the filter envelope isn't also modulating the filter right now, I'm going to put that envelope amount at 0. And then I'm going to get rid of the LFO going to that attenuator. And instead, I'm going to take the envelope out to the input of the attenuator. I'm going to just go with one oscillator so you can hear this a little better. And now I'm going to use the envelope to change pulse width modulation. And it's nice because it has a motion that obviously doesn't sound like an LFO, and it almost sounds like you're changing filter a little bit, but you're not. You're changing timbre over time in a single shot way. And clearly I'm going too far, so I ease up on the attenuation. And another nice thing about using an envelope, it's very predictable. I know that every time I hit a key, it's going to do that. Maybe I want to fall slower. Change my decay. And now I'll turn the other oscillators 2 and 3 back on. And I could change some of the oscillators. Instead of starting at square, I could start at pulse, and that will definitely have a different behavior. And now what you want to do with the envelope is very much going to change with how you're using it. If you're playing slow lines, that's one thing. If you're doing an arpeggiation, you've got to make your envelope do something interesting within the amount of time of each note, or you might not even hear a difference. So let's get an arpeggiation going here. And now I'll adjust the depth of the envelope going to pulse width modulation. And this time I'll even go upside down because with an envelope it matters. Like I said before, timing is going to very much change how you set those things. Not only what the attack, decay, release, sustain is, but how much of that is going to go to it. And it will change as you change all of these things. So always be flexible about trying that. And so to do something that's very sonically obvious, I'm just going to take the triangle out LFO over here and just bang it right into the pitch in of oscillator 1. Now, obviously, that's too much. So instead of going from the triangle out into the pitch in, we'll come from the attenuator output and then take triangle out and go into the attenuator input. Now I can go from nothing to full on, which you heard before. So I can get a normal vibrato if I wanted. And now, because I can control the attenuation, I can have a mild vibrato and still go to the extreme. But it's touchy. You really got to have a fine touch on that to just have just enough for vibrato. Now, of course, I can also do that exact same kind of modulation with the modulation section. And the biggest difference is that you have to move the mod wheel to get these to do something. So if I turn the mod wheel all the way up, well, there's no vibrato, there's no pitch amount yet, so I turn this knob up. Well, obviously that's way too much, so The idea is throw the mod wheel all the way up and then pick the amount that you want when the mod wheel is all the way up. I would go a little more than normal so that you have somewhere to go. And so I'll speed it up a little bit. Maybe still a little bit too much. Okay, and then underneath that is a switch called Pitch Mod Assign. And basically what it's letting you do is make that LFO either go to all 4 oscillators, which is the all position in the middle, or only oscillators 1 and 3, or only oscillators 2 and 4. Why is that important? Mostly about oscillator sync. So when you're syncing one oscillator to be locked in pitch to the other, but moving one of the frequencies, that you get this very interesting harmonic thing. For more on oscillator sync, watch my oscillator sync episode of Synth Clips number 17. But for now, I have it set to all, so they're all going to do it. And the idea being, again, that you throw the mod wheel all the way up, get the depth you want at the rate you want. And start getting in the habit of not pushing any knob or any wheel or any controller always as hard as you can to the max. You're basically turning it into a switch. Maybe start learning to do mod wheel, maybe only a quarter of the amount that you normally want, so that you have in reserve the craziness after. So you got that. So again, when you're setting that all the way up, set it for the craziest that you want it, and everything else will extrapolate all the way down to where you want it. Now I'm going to add 2 oscillators. So I've got oscillator 1 at 12 o'clock, and I'm bringing in oscillator 2. And we'll set them both right now to sawtooth waves. And you're going to hear some detuning. It's an analog synthesizer. And as we'll talk a little bit later in the global section, you can actually set it so that every time you hit a note, each of the oscillators slightly drifts an amount. And you can actually set the maximum amount of drift in 1.4 cent intervals all the way up to 40 cents, which is way too much, which is beautiful, that you can go from too little to too much. But so I have it on there a little bit, so it's going to be impossible to always get perfectly in tune. And so you get that phasing effect, which is what makes these analog synthesizers sound so good. And what you're hearing is the difference between the two frequencies. If you had 440 and 439, you're going to hear that sweeping sound at 1 hertz. It's just one subtracted from the other. That's one of the original reasons that the sync enable button was invented, to lock those oscillators perfectly in sync. And so now I'll detune very slightly oscillator 2 against it. And as you do that, and as you add more oscillators, you're going to get more and more thickness, more fatness out of that. And it's just a beautiful sound. And you can also do other intervals. Currently, I have this set so that each of these sweeps from 0 to max adds an octave. Now, in the default, it actually only goes up a fifth, which can be also really handy. But if you have ears and you can detect intervals, I would say go for an octave. It gives you so much more flexibility to be able to get to notes above a fifth without having to use your knob to go to the next octave. And that's set in the global, and we'll talk about that later. But here's the sweep, an octave up and an octave down. And after you've done your knob calibrations, it should be exactly at 3 o'clock that gives you the fifth. That's going to be a little harder because I do have the pitch variation on, which I like for just fattening everything up. So now we're going to turn the sync enable on with the idea of locking oscillator 2 to oscillator 1, and I hit it, it's still moving. Why? Because not only do you enable it, but you've got to tell that particular oscillator to sync. to this oscillator. This. Now that sync enable button works. This is really powerful, especially when you realize that you can do vibrato of 1 and 3 or 2 and 4 while the other ones are synced to the other oscillators, so you can get oscillator sync sounds that are really beautiful and moving by using all that. So now listen as I change the pitch of oscillator 2. And to make it easier to hear this, I'm going to turn off oscillator 1. It's still doing its job of syncing oscillator 2, but you don't have to hear it for it to work. So here we go. And just one of the quirks of sync is you don't want your oscillator that's being synced to be in lower in frequency than the master oscillator. So in this case, you only want to turn the knob clockwise, but you get that really cool sound. And now here's where that pitch mod assign switch comes in really handy. If I take it from all and throw it to 2 and 4, and again, right now I've only got oscillators 1 and 2 going. I'm not using 3 and 4. But I can hear oscillator 1. I can hear oscillator 2. But, and I'm just leave 2 up right now, as I add vibrato to 2, but not 1, then I'm going to be doing a harmonic vibrato as opposed to a frequency vibrato. And remember when I told you that the oscillator that's being controlled by the master oscillator cannot be lower in frequency than the original, you're going to find that because this wave that we're using from the LFO is bipolar, it's better to turn your frequency about halfway up, and that way we can get to both ends of it, like so. Whereas if I leave this back at 0, half the time it's going to be too low and not work. And you'll find just turning that up. And now I'm not changing oscillator 1 at all. I'm changing oscillator 2. And it doesn't matter what shape I use. And this is one where I can even use random that's smooth. And this, we'll get back into effects later, but just to turn them now, just to hear how beautiful that is. And like pretty much anything that can be controlled from control voltages, you can use an LFO, but you could also use an envelope or anything else. We'll use the filter envelope again. And because I have the envelope amount set to 0 here, it's not going to affect my filtering at all, but it will affect the synchronization effect. So here we go. Here's Here's a case where maybe you do want to go a little bit left of center on the frequency because I have so much envelope that I need to pull it down a little bit. And because the two oscillators have their own volume, I can make that effect less noticeable. And if it's still doing it too much, I can use an attenuator. So come out of the attenuator instead of the envelope out, and then just go input from the envelope out. Now I can control it. And then you can balance the effect with oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 mix levels. None, obviously, to all of it. And you can try different wave shapes for each of them. And another use for the pitch in is if you are using an external keyboard that can send 4 different pitches or 4 different control voltage for the pitches. Normally I would use like a KeyStep Pro, which is brilliant in that it has 4 outs. You go to the 4 oscillators, play chords, and it just works, which means that I could have a different sequence for each of the oscillators, which is very powerful. But again, I'm not doing one of those show-off kind of videos. I just want you to understand what's going on here. So I'm not going to do that right now, but it is very cool. So another source that I can use, this was a little bizarre, but I can use noise as a way of modulating an oscillator, and guess what? It makes the oscillator noisy, right? So pull all this, and I'm going to take my oscillator sync off, and I'm just going to have one oscillator here, oscillator 1, sawtooth, and I'm going to go pitch in, and I'm going to do noise out. Which kind of a noisy sound. If you remember video games in the 80s, that's how they used to do car engines. And when you were going off the edge of the road, you know, so it would be that squeal. Too much, obviously. So again, attenuator. I'll use this one over here. So noise out into the input, then output of the attenuator to the pitch in. And now with this exactly at 0, you shouldn't hear anything. And then I turn it up. And if you use just a little bit, it gives you some nice little spitty kind of sounds. Now that's with it in pitch in. If I go instead to linear FM in, I get this. And if I go to pulse within, I get this. It's just a new flavor for your box of crayons. And then the last jack up there is your wave out, which lets you take each oscillator out of the path, send it somewhere else, and do something with it. So you could have some oscillators working in here, but some oscillators going somewhere else. They could even be oscillators to be used as control voltages for something else. And then another use for the wave out is to use as a modulation source for another oscillator. So if I'm going to turn oscillator 1 off so you're not hearing it, just going to hear oscillator 2, and I'm going to take wave out of 1 and modulate the pitch of oscillator 2. And notice as I change either the pitch of the oscillator via keys, and now I'm going to sweep the frequency of oscillator 2. So I can use the frequency knob to fine-tune a particular note, but typically most of the other notes aren't going to work as beautifully. Every once in a while you'll find one. So again, we go with the attenuator, take the wave out, into the attenuator, into the input, out of that into pitch in of number 2, and now I have depth control of that. Great for going in and out of hyperspace and things like that. Now I'll do the same thing, and instead of going into pitch in, I'm going to go into linear FM in. Notice now that I'm still getting the FM, but I can use it musically across the keyboard. And like everything else we're doing like this, your attenuation, your rate, your depths, all of those things are going to change depending on where you're playing on the keyboard and what each of the oscillators are set to. So always be very flexible and move very slowly. Like I always say, don't turn a knob unless you're playing a key and can hear yourself moving the knob. Otherwise, you're shooting yourself in the foot. So now to do something crazy really quick, I'll take the triangle out of the LFO and put that into the amount of attenuation, so that will be changing over time. And now to just do something really different, I'll do the square out, and it will just do a slightly different modulation shape. Crazy with that too. I could do something for the rate in on that, or I could put that into yet another attenuator. Now let's talk about ways of getting the most out of the 4 notes of paraphony. Paraphony is when each of your oscillators are going to a different pitch based on the keys, but they're all going to the same mixer. That mixer's all going to the same filter. That filter's all going to the same amp, and that's all going to the same output. So you could kind of pretend that you got 4 separate notes, but you really don't. You have 4 separate frequencies, and they can seem to move independently from each other, but they can't each have their own articulation of filter and volume and things like that. And so the first thing you do is throw the voice mode to number 1 and get the tuning perfect. So I'm going to just start with 1, which presumably is perfect, but if it's not, get a pocket tuner and use this fine tune, get that perfectly in tune, just hit a note and then get it to that note. But for oscillator 2 now, I'm going to bring it up. Make sure they're all in the same octave. And if you've just done that calibration procedure, you should be able to bring it right to 0 and have it pretty darn well in tune. And then oscillator 3. And oscillator 4. And so they're fairly well in tune, but they're big. So in 4-voice mode, each of the notes is getting its own oscillator, but they're kind of lifeless because it's a single oscillator not beating against anything else. There's no modulation going on. So this is where the pulse width modulation trick really comes in. So I'm going to use a MULT to take the output of an attenuated LFO. And again, I always do my input on my bottom left. Then I'm going to do the triangle out into the attenuator. Then I'm going to take my first output from the MULT and I'm going to go into pulse width in of 1. And then I'll do another one into pulse width modulation in of 2. And a third one, I'll go into 3. Now, for some reason, it was really important that all 4 had pulse width modulation. You could use up your other MULT or use an external MULT. They make these little ones that are just little discs with 4, 5, 3.5 millimeter female jacks, and then one male 3.5 millimeter plug. So you would just plug that in and split them out. Definitely worth investing in some of those if you're trying to get crazy. And so now I need to set my waveforms to either square wave or the thinner pulse wave. And I'd recommend going with the thinner one because this triangle wave is bipolar. So by putting it there, it lets you get the sound correctly on both ends of the sweep. And so now I turn oscillator 1 up and hear it. I could set the depth and rate. And now if I bring up the other oscillators, and make sure I'm in 4-note paraphony, I should be able to get really nice pulse width modulation on 4 notes. And so I have more life, more motion, and that motion is not only good on its own, but when you add reverb and or delay, you're getting all of that motion layered on top of itself. So vibrato without reverb or vibrato without delay is kind of pointless. It's always important when you're doing vibrato, always be thinking about how that sounds in reverb or in delay. So here I'll turn up the delay. So now I'm starting to get a pretty sweet sound, even though I've only got 1 oscillator per chord note. So there's one trick you can do. We could also do modulation to only some of the oscillators or all of the oscillators. So I'm going to start with all so that we're doing pitch modulation of all 4 oscillators. And again, with some delay. So the next thing is the mixer. And all of the inputs are defaulted to what they say on these knobs, but always remember that whatever goes into these 5 inputs is now what that knob controls. So So if for some reason you needed to mix 4 or 5 other things externally, you could bring them into these 5 inputs, and those will be your knobs, which would then go to the filters in the amp, and so on. If you're not using noise, you can always use noise in as an external in, and now you've got a way of blending something from the outside world into this mixer that again goes to the filters in the amp. You've also got an output from the mixer, so you could send that to somewhere else and do something with that. So definitely some flexibility in there to be experimented with, but let's move on to the filters. So I'm going to start with a plain sound again. Let's do sawtooth, and we'll keep them all at the same octave for right now. And there's some confusion with this because they've given you some flexibility, and with flexibility comes a little complexity, so deal with it. And that is that there's really 2 filters in here. They can either be 2 low-pass filters, one on the left, one on the right. They can be a high-pass filter that goes into a low-pass filter, which is serial, or it could be a high-pass filter going to the amp and a low-pass filter going to the amp, each with their own individual signal pass, so they're parallel. The one you use probably the most often is the stereo low-pass and low-pass. And if you set the spacing to 0, then you should hear the identical thing in the left channel and the right channel. And as I turn up the resonance, but notice that I could turn up the resonance only on one side if I wanted. And so as I'm sweeping the knob, you're noticing stereo changes. You're noticing position changes because the one with resonance is boosting in certain areas, and sometimes it's louder than the other side. But other times when it's in areas where there's no frequencies to boost, the other side sounds louder. And so you're hearing this motion. And then there's a parameter called spacing, which lets you set how far apart the cutoff frequency is from the left side and the right side. So I'm going to do this with noise, I think. And again, I'm in the stereo low-pass mode. And I'm going to turn this up. And as expected, I get the similar thing on both sides. But now watch if I set my spacing differently. I'll go somewhere in the middle. Now, one side still has some cutoff and the other side's pretty much closed. And as I open it, those 2 cutoffs are going to move like this. And I can flip it. And where that becomes really interesting is when you start adding resonance. And this was a trick that was used in the Voyager a lot because they had a separate filter for each side, and you could do this stuff. So spacing is something you want to play with when you want a different frequency cutoff on the left and the right. And that's when we're talking about in the stereo mode where it's the same low-pass filter on each side. Now, if I change this to a low-pass filter and a high-pass filter in series, now I'm changing with the big cutoff knob. I can change how much the high pass is cutting bass. If I turn the spacing all the way to the left, I've got my normal amount of bass frequencies. As I start turning it up, now I'm losing the bottom end. I still have the sweep of the low pass. And then the third mode, which is parallel, now you hear that I have a high pass filter. as well as a low-pass filter, but each on their own side. And whether I move that by hand or by an envelope, now we're getting almost zero through flange kind of sounds. And again with delay. Very cool. And then the jacks on top of the filter section let you bring your own audio source in instead of the mixer. You'll be bypassing the mixer by going into VCF1 in or VCF2 in. So you could, for example, if you needed a high-pass filter for something else, go into the parallel version, bring the thing that needs the high pass into VCF1, bring the thing that needs the low pass into VCF2, or just let the default do it. And now you can completely process two different sounds with two different filter types. You've also got VCF1 and 2 out, so you can send those to other places besides going into the amp where it normally goes. On the bottom, you got your control voltages in, so you have separate control voltage control of your high pass and your low pass, or when you're in stereo mode, your low pass 1 and your low pass 2. You've also got envelope amount in, so you could be changing the amount of envelope in real time. So let me set that up real quick. So I'm going to make some sound here with some envelope. And make something tight like that. And now I'm going to go from my triangle out to my envelope amount in, and it'll be changing the envelope amount. And you'll notice that with an arpeggiation. So let's move over here. We've talked about it some already, but let's talk about modulation. So I'm going to just go back to one oscillator, got my effects off, got my filter wide open. And I'm going to, as I showed before, anything that you use from these three knobs have to have mod wheel up. And I could do the same to cutoff. And I could do pulse width modulation at the same time. And again with some delay. And anytime you can add this complexity by having multiple things being modulated, it's just always going to be more interesting to listen to. And we'll do the shapes real quick. So now to be very specific, I'm going to come out of the wave out of modulation to pitch in of oscillator 1. I'm only hearing the one oscillator. And now I don't have to use the mod wheel. Now I can have full strength, which almost always is too much. So you go first into the attenuator. And you'll see, you wish I had 10 attenuators. Eventually, you'll just buy external attenuators because it's just so useful. And then here are your wave shapes: sine wave, sawtooth, ramp, square, and stepped random, and smooth random. Of all of them, I use that one the least. And you can take separate outs, so you've got the wave out, so you don't have to go through the mod wheel. You can also take a dedicated sample and hold out for random to other things that, again, is not controlled by the wheel. So another one of the output jacks on modulation is noise out. And you've already heard what it sounds like if I use that control voltage from noise out to do pitch of an oscillator. It gives it a certain gritty sound. It does a similar thing to the filters, in that if I take noise out and put it into the cutoff in, and like everything else, if that's too much, go into an attenuator. And now we can control how much of that's happening here. Here's none. And there are also some ins. There's a sync in for modulation that you can use for timing from something else. And there's a rate in. So, for example, if I wanted to do a complex modulation of having a vibrato, but I wanted the speed of that modulation to be going up and down, for example, I could take the output of this triangle over here, and now the speed of this LFO is going to be going up and down based on the rate of this LFO. But like everything else, it's too much, so attenuator. And so now you can use the attenuator to decide how much the pitch is being deflected. Use the LFO rate to determine how fast and slow it's getting. And if you want to get crazy, like I like to do, I might control the rate in of this LFO with something else. Let's try an envelope. Let's see what happens. Take out one side of the stereo delay, which I'll explain when I get to the delay section, but here it is in full ping pong. Okay, now let's talk about the stereo delays, because that's a big deal to me. In fact, if I'm ever trying to talk somebody into buying a Matriarch, I bring up the Series 500 analog delay from Moog, which is discontinued and people are paying ridiculous prices for. Well, there's two of those in here, and each one is capable of doing its own stereo ping pong delay, which is amazing. Now, one of the quirks of that is if you use both of the delays in stereo ping pong, you don't hear the pinging and the ponging because they're fighting against each other. So one of the things you can do is just make a dummy plug. Just take one of these and just cut the end off. But for now, I'm just going to stick a cable in. But let me show you what I'm talking about. So first, I'll make a real plain blip. Okay, so now if I turn the mix up and I have a single blip and I have my spacing set at 0, I get a plain old monaural, non-stereo echo. But if I want to get that ping pong sound, I can hit ping pong, but strangely, you don't get the effect you're looking for. And that's because you've got to block one of the inputs. And again, just a cable end or a blank cable right into input 2. Now we got stereo. I'll turn the feedback up and the mix up so you can really hear it. That's what you're looking for. And so if you have a cable that's bad, just cut one of the ends off and just use it as a plug, or you can make a little special something with a jewel on it, whatever you want. And it doesn't matter which one you kill, whether you kill input 1 or 2, you get the same effect. But again, if you don't kill one of them, you don't get the ping pong effect that you want. Well, why is this a good thing? Well, the reason it's a good thing is it means you can have true stereo ping-pong delay for your entire matriarch, and then you can bring something from somewhere else into input 2 and have yet another stereo ping-pong delay that audibly is independent from the first one. So you can have two entirely different signals going in there. But I got to say, just always get in the habit of blocking one of the inputs when you just want that simple back and forth. And that's what you want when you're doing stuff like this. We'll go down an octave here. That's why I love a ping pong delay. You do that. So that of all the tips, really, of all the tips on this thing, my favorite tip is block input 1 or input 2, and when you turn on ping pong, you're just going to be so much happier with the result. Another button on the delay, which is sync. Anytime you turn sync on, it has to do with synchronization of timing as opposed to sync for the oscillators. Your rate or time knobs typically stop being free-flowing minimum to maximum knobs. Instead, they jump different units of time against whatever it is syncing to. So listen, the easiest way is to just make a little arpeggiation and then put the echo against it. So I'm going to leave the ping pong on. I'm going to have one of my inputs disabled so I can really hear the ping pong. And I'll turn on arpeggiation. We'll get going here. Okay, that'll work. Now I turn the echo up first without synchronization, and you'll see that I can sweep to whatever time I want. And it's obviously very pretty. And with synchronization off, if you have the patience, you can slowly dial in a time that one does the rhythmic trick you want, but then by being slightly off of that, you're getting these little extra flangey bits and little flams, and just always far more interesting than a straight sync of a unit of the beat. But sometimes that's really great to have sync on so you can get exactly what you're looking for. So you heard me sweep with the sync off, now sweep with the sync on. And so as you can hear, I'm always getting some nice even unit of the beat. And there are some that seem a little weird. Those are typically triplets or dotted eighth notes or things like that. But you can't get in between those with this mode. It just jumps to the next one. You can hear there's just a lot of beauty to be found in trying different delay times against the clock and against an arpeggiation. So now I'm going to talk about spacing, and that is an offset of delay time 1 against delay time 2. So you can make it faster than delay 2 or slower than delay 2, or when it's at 0, it's the same time. So now I'm going to do a simple arpeggiation to help show what happens when you're doing spacing. Now in this case, the delay is pretty centered because I don't have ping pong on. I have no synchronization. My spacing is the same, and so it should just sound like a monaural delay. But now listen as I change the spacing time of delay 1. And those pitch changes you're hearing, that just happens in an analog delay when you change its time. So you have to let it settle out for a few seconds before you decide if the value you just chose is good for you. And so the point of that is, even if you have a very simple arpeggiation, you can do all kinds of amazing sonic tricks just by playing with the time, the feedback, the spacing, the mix, whether it's synced and whether the ping pong's on, and whether or not you're blocking one of the inputs. All right, now I'd like to talk about some of the sources of voltage that you have on the back here. So for example, if I take keyboard AT, which is Aftertouch, out, and now this control voltage from Aftertouch can pretty much go to anything that takes control voltage in. The easiest to hear, of course, is pitch, so that's where we're going to go. And so I should have a little squeezy toy now. Now, that's probably more control than you want. So as always, I say, go to the input of an attenuator, come out of the attenuator, go back to the same place, and now I can have it be subtle. And with anything that's moving like that, it will always sound better with a little bit of delay. But it doesn't have to go to pitch, it can go to something else. So I'll go to filter cutoff. If I do it to 1, I can send that resonant sweep through the delay now. So another source is expression pedal. If you take a TRS 1/4 inch expression pedal and plug it into this 1/4 inch jack, and then take the CV out from that, it's going to do exactly the same thing as that I just did with Aftertouch. So the point being is that you now have foot control over any parameter on here that has a CV input. You've got Aftertouch control. You can have mod wheel control. You can have pitch control. So you've got a lot of real-time expression things that you really need to be exploring. Another one is keyboard velocity out. And that, again, can go to anything. I've already got it through the attenuator. So for example, let's set it to the filter. So now I have velocity control over cutoff. And I can sweep its range with the attenuator over here, as well as the envelope amount. Now the envelope amount, while taking that, is also getting the filter envelope amount. So I can do that here, so I can have a shape that's repeatable, but is now also being modulated by velocity. And if it's too sensitive, just bring it down. But you could do anything with it. You could do crazy stuff. You could do a different LFO rate based on velocity. So I'll go to sine wave, and I'm going to have my attenuated velocity going to rate in. Let's first get a vibrato. So now, different velocities will have a different vibrato rate. And I can change the rate of the modulation and the attenuator amount to find the exact min and max that I want. And because velocity is currently not going to anything else, velocity is not going to change the volume or the brightness or anything, just the vibrato rate. Let's try something crazy. Let's take that instead. Let's go to the rate of the arpeggiator. This should be crazy. It's that kind of stuff you always want to be thinking about. And then another thing to think about is like what's left over. Now, when I was a kid in game shows, there used to be this thing where you'd get your money at the end of the game show and you'd go, I'll take that sofa and I'll take that refrigerator. And then you'd have $70 left over. And it would always say, well, spend $70 on a Spiegel gift certificate, which was kind of what they always did. The point being that when you're doing this and you got everything plugged in and you got the sound you want, then you go, I got 5 cables left or I got 10 jacks left. What additional thing can I do to make it yet one step crazier? And that's kind of what you do with a modular. It's why you have a modular in the first place. So do these little tricks of getting something connected and always start your experiments simple. Like just do a modulation source to an oscillator and listen what it does. And only after you get it dialed in do you start adding something else. When you try and do everything at the same time, there's no way your brain can process what effects are happening because of which modules and which attenuation depths and what synchronization and what rates, and all of that is something that you just have to hear piece at a time. Keep it simple until you're ready for all the complexity to happen at once. All right, so I've got a little bit of time left, and what I really want to do is go through a bunch of the globals because they're super powerful. And granted, in a perfect world, every one of those global things would be a switch and a button on here, but now this thing would be twice as big. And so what they put in the globals are choices that hopefully you don't have to make very often, but I'm going to walk through them with you to show you which ones I use and what settings I prefer and why. Your mileage may totally vary, but at least you'll know what I do and you can base it off of that. And so to talk about globals, I'm going to have the manual out. It's a lot to remember. But again, the beauty is once you make a decision that you like, you shouldn't have to change it very often, especially on some of them. They're a one-time set it and forget. And a lot of times the defaults are what you want, but I certainly have my own preferences. And so the first global we're going to do is note priority. And in the old days, synths often had on their front panel a switch that was either high note priority, low note priority, or last note priority. And the high and the low note was really for when you were trying to simulate having two independent notes on a synthesizer, and you'd make one listen to only the high note, one listen to only the low note, and you could play one keyboard, play two notes. Hopefully they went the way you wanted and there wasn't too much glitching. But other than that, I really don't have a use for low note or high note. I always want the last note that I hit to be the last note that's played. Watch. And if I go down, the last note that I played is the note I wanted to do. But let me show you what happens if I change that. So I hold, hit sync enable till it blinks. And now you have to start paying attention to the number of times it blinks because that tells you where you are. And I'm going to do note priority, and it tells me to hit C#0, which for this purpose, this is C0, so this is C#0. I hit it one time, and there's a single blink. And that single blink tells me I'm in note priority. And I just showed you what it sounded like with last note priority, but let's say I made it low note priority. So I hit C0 and I turn it off. Now, my high notes are not picking up, only lower notes. And I don't like it because you can accidentally not hear notes if you happen to have your thumb down and you're holding a note already. You might not hear the new note come out. Same with high note priority. Same thing. Wait till it blinks. Hit C#0, then hit D. Now I've got high note priority, but not low note. So honestly, your best one on that is just to leave it at the default, which is E. So I hit C#0, then I hit E, and I turn it off. That one's easy. All right, moving on. Glide type. So there are different types. So normally with glide, the glide goes the same speed. Like think of it as a car driving to the new note. The car's always going at the same speed. So short notes, it doesn't sound too glidey. Long notes sounds really glidey. But maybe you have a situation where you want the glide to be the same even if you're doing short notes and long notes. That's the next global mode. Hold, hit sync enable till it blinks. I can see that my glide type is D#0, so I hit D#0. Then it's telling me that C0 is linear constant rate, which is what I just played you. But now I'm going to change it to linear constant time by hitting D0, turn it off. And now so long distances take exactly the same amount of time as short distances. I don't use it as much because if it's up too high, your short distances start sounding really out of tune. Usually I want short distances to get there quickly. And then there's a third choice of exponential, which is you hit D2, and for exponential you hit E0. And now it's just a different curve of how it gets there. I'll do a long glide and you'll hear it. So you can hear it starts faster, and then as you're getting close to the note, it starts to slow up a little bit. For certain songs, that's a great effect, but for me, I almost always want to go with LCR, linear constant rate. The glide is going the same amount of speed, and so it takes longer to get to far distances than it does to get to short distance. Hold, hit sync enable till it blinks. I do D sharp 0 and I hit C0, and now very fast for short distances, longer for long distance. Next one, gated glide. This is the gliding only happens as long as the key is down, but as soon as you let go of a key, no matter where you are, the gliding stops. It just freezes where it is. Usually that results in you playing and all of a sudden your notes are left out of tune because you were gliding to the new note, but then you just stopped somewhere in between. There may be situations where that's exactly what you want. Very rarely is it for me. I always want the non-gated glide. And so the way you do that, get back into your mode here, and you hit F sharp 0. And to turn it off, I use C0. And now so now I have a nice long release time. So now I'm going to turn the release up longer, and you can hear, even after I let go of the key, the glide's still going to happen. Conversely, if I set gated glide to on, hold, like enable, F sharp 0 and D0, now when I let go in the middle, it's going to stop gliding. So one of the things that would be useful for that is if you wanted to just keep hitting a key and keep gliding more toward it every time you hit the key, it would go a little farther each time. But it's more of a special effect. So again, hold, sync enable, F sharp 0, and then I turn it off, which is C0. Now, next one, pitch bend range. I know every synthesizer you get in a store, when you bend like this, you get 2 steps. When you bend down, you get 2 steps down. That's really boring because you always want the ability to overshoot a little bit. It's what makes a guitar pitch bend so much more expressive than a pitch wheel bend, because this one, it goes and then like hits a wall and stops there. And a guitar, there's no wall like that. So I'd recommend pitch bend ranges greater than 2. Yeah, it takes a little more finesse because you're going over a wider range. So try, for example, a minor third. And then learn not to push the pitch bend wheel all the way. You'll find now that you can do vibratos on your top note because you can go above and below that pitch bent note, or go for a fifth, so now you could do a bend to an exact interval that's musically useful. The one I like is an octave. Sure, you have to be really careful to do a whole step bend, but now I can just instantly rip up a whole octave, rip down a whole octave, which basically turns this 4-octave keyboard into a 6-octave keyboard just by using the pitch wheel. So to get my 1-octave pitch bend range, hold, sync enable till it blinks. Pitch bend range is G sharp 0, and I want to go up 12 half steps. So I start on 0, so you can have pitch bend doing nothing. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I hit that, and now I should have a full octave and a full pitch bend octave down. But let's say I wanted to do a fifth. Hold, sync enable, wait till it's blinking, G sharp 0. Then I want to go a fifth. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And if you just have to have it at 2 steps, hold, think, G sharp 0, and just 2 steps. So 0, 1, 2. Your call. But try doing it at an octave and just learning to more subtly do pitch bends that still sound like you're at 2. Now you can all of a sudden do your normal pitch bends and leap up an octave and leap down an octave very quickly. So the next one is pitch variance. This is the thing that they throw in digital synthesizers to try and make them sound more analog. Well, now they've thrown it in an analog synthesizer to try and make it sound more analog. Mostly it's because we've gotten so good at making the oscillators play in tune that we kind of miss some of the drift and slippage of the oscillator frequencies. And so what this does is it randomly gives you some number of cents offset every time you hit the key. So if I set it to 0, and I do that by holding this and hitting that, and then pitch variance is A sharp 0, and if I set it to 0, which is C0, then if I have 2 oscillators, every time I hit them, once I get them perfectly in tune, now every time I hit the key, it should be the same. Okay, but let me do that again, and this time I'll go crazy with it. So pitch variance is A sharp 0, and I'm going to go all the way to max C4. Now it's 40 cents off. Every time I hit a key, four voice mode, it's horrible. Polyphony is when you really start hearing detuning issues. Right? So I found somewhere between this C and that C gets me about the amount I want. So I'm going to do it again. So pitch variance is A sharp 0, and I'm going to hit this C right here. Now, it stays pretty much in tune, and when I go back to mono mode, you hear that every time I hit a key, I'm getting different detuning. It's very slight, but nice. It's actually a little more subtle than I'd like, so I'll go up a little more. So again, A sharp 0, and I'll go with this C. That's probably too much. So one more time, I'll split the difference. I'll go to F sharp. No, I'll go to G. Sorry, there is no F sharp. You really want it so that just every note has a little bit of subtle behavior. How much of that's up to you. The next one is the oscillator frequency range. And that's where I'm going to turn all the oscillators off except for 2. And you know what? I'm going to bring the variance back to 0 so we can really hear this thing. So do that. I do A sharp 0. I hit C0, turn that off. So if you just bought your Matriarch, the default is a 5th on these frequency knobs. That's a very handy thing. It's a very synthy thing to do. Whether you're going up a 5th or down. But for me, I like to set this to an octave, and I suggest it for you as well. We'll just do it here real quick. So I do that, and then my oscillator knob range is C sharp 1, and then I want to go an octave. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now, just a lot more flexibility because I can go an octave down as well. you can still find your fifth. It's at 3 o'clock, especially if you've done your calibration recently. But now you can go more. And if you want just an incredible range of frequency sweep, we'll do 24 half steps. So I hit, again, C#1, but this time I'm going to go to F3. And now I've got 24 half steps, or 2 octaves in either direction. I've got a 4-octave sweep with this knob now. Very cool. However, it's a lot harder to get something perfectly in tune for other intervals. And if you're doing Oscillator Sync, it gets ridiculous. The next one is square LFO polarity, and I have a definite opinion on this one. So, on most waves when you're modulating something, you want it to go up just as much as you want it to go down. And that's kind of how vibrato works. But with square waves, doing an exact amount in each direction away from the main pitch does not end up with musical intervals very often. And so I like to do a unipolar square wave. In other words, the square wave always starts at 0, then goes up to the amount that you set it, but then always comes back to 0. In other words, it doesn't change the pitch, then it changes the pitch that you want, and then back to the original pitch. So hold, sync enable, and that's D#1, which is this one. And then for unipolar, you hit C0. And that sounds like this. So notice that every lower note is always on the right pitch, and it's only the higher note that's jumping. And what does it sound like if I go the other way? That's D#1 and then D for bipolar. Now notice that as I turn up the wheel, I go from my normal pitch, but I go up a little and I go down a little, up farther, down farther, but they're not on standard musical notes, so it might not be what you're looking for. And it's not till you get to octaves that you enjoy the pitch differences, because it's just making these pitch differences that aren't in the musical scale, unless you're doing it for an effect. Okay, now the other way, D#1, and now notice just how much more musical it is. So the next one is noise filter cutoff. And this is really cool because in most synths that don't have screens, you either turn the noise on or turn it off and then change its volume. It obviously goes through the filter, so if you have a low-pass filter, you can roll the high end off, but the amount of bass in your noise pretty much stays the same. So some companies give you white noise, some companies give you pink noise. They're trying to guess which one you're going to use the most. But this one is very cool in that it allows you to throw a high-pass filter unrelated to any of these filters. It lets you throw a high-pass filter just on the noise so you can roll off the amount of noise that you want. So turn all the oscillators off, turn noise up. And I'll turn my filter all the way up. Okay, now I'm going to go with no high-pass filter. So first of all, it's F sharp 1, and I go to C0. Now notice there's bottom end. Plenty of bottom down there. I'm going to leave that filter closed just so you can hear it better. So now I'm going to do the same thing, F sharp 1, and this time I'm going to hit C4, which is the most high-pass filtering. In other words, it's cutting the lows the most. And now listen to this sound. Listen how much more delicate and wispy your noise is. So this is perfect for doing hi-hats, wispy kind of wind sounds, steam sounds. But if you're going to do thunder or low explosions or something, you want that high pass filter to let as much bass through as possible. F sharp 1, I hit C0. Now, and you get all of the variations in between from going from C0 to C4 when you're on that parameter. The next one has to do with the delay. And I love analog delays mostly because you can change the time in real time and get that which I love that kind of stuff. And you can speed it back up. But in a digital delay, often that garbles up the signal when you do that because they're not really changing the playback speed. They're just tapping into a different part of the delay. And so everything kind of gets a little bit garbled. But on an analog delay, one of the things I don't like is that they tend to be darker. The echoes are darker than they are in a digital delay. And the reason is because of how the bucket brigades work. They can only sample so fast if you have only a certain number of delay chips in there, and delay chips are expensive. So you can't sample, in other words, you can't grab the voltage and stick it in one of these capacitors as fast as you would want to for high frequencies. So there's usually errors and aliasing and things that you normally don't think about with analog, but it does happen in a delay because of there actually is sampling even though it's analog. And so they tend to roll off the high end, so they're just darker so you don't hear any of that noise. But I would rather have a little bit more grit and noise and aliasing and have a bright delay. So let me show you first with it dark. So hold, sync enable. It's G sharp 1, and I am going to hit C0, and that's the darker version. And it will do a quick blip and listen to that delay time. Oh, better use a note, huh? You can hear that the very first delay is pretty dark. Now, people who love analog delays, one of the reasons they do love analog delays is because it is dark like that. So your echoes are not competing with your main sound. Me, I like the sparkle and the sizzle that a delay adds, and so I want the brighter version. So hold, sync enable, G sharp 1, and then hit D0. And now listen to the same thing. Hear how the first delay is a little bit closer sonically to the original signal. And if I do a ping pong and do a little arpeggiation, you'll just see why I like that. Now let's see if I can change it real time without losing my arpeggiation. Delay for the brightness, G#1, and I hit this. And now same thing, if it's still gone, it is. Now listen how far back sonically the delays are because of how much darker they are. They each have their place. I like the brighter one myself. So same thing. And then G#1 and then D0. Now I'm back. The next one's a little trickier to understand. It's called delay sync CV bend. Basically, when it's on, the time CV inputs, so you got time 1 in, time 2 in, they bend the pitch less than they normally would, so it's easier to use your delay to create chorus. My advice is to turn it on, and it defaults to off, so it's one you might want to turn on. So I do this, I do A#1, I do D0. And so now we're into all the globals that have to do with MIDI channels, input channel, output channel, MIDI echo, clock inputs, outputs, local control of the keyboard, local control of the arpeggiator, whether it receives program changes, sends program changes for choosing different sequences, various clock options. I'm not going to go into all those because they're all going to be very specific to what you're doing. And if you're doing that kind of stuff, you'll be able to understand these instructions. But here's a few interesting ones. Sequencer transpose mode. Basically what it says is after you recorded a sequence, and let's say your sequence started on D for some reason, if you're in the first note mode, even though you recorded it in D, if you play E, it's going to play in E. If you play G, it's going to play in G. One nice thing about that mode is you always know what key it's going to be in once you slam your hand down. The other mode is called middle C mode, and that means as long as you play middle C, it's going to play back in the key you recorded in, and it will only transpose when you move away from middle C. I go back and forth on this one, but I'm starting to think that I like the mode where whatever key you push is the start of your sequence. And so I hit D#2 and then G#0, and now I'm going to hit C, and then I'm out. And what that means is if I make a little sequence here, we'll go to record, and I'll do it in the key of F. Okay, and now I play that, it starts on F. But if I play D, B flat. This is good when you want to be playing along live and you just want to know that if I hit E flat, it's going to start on E flat. Or the other way of thinking, go back here, do my transpose modes, D#2, hit G#0, and then hit D0. Now, if I hit middle C, it's going to be in the key that I played it in. And if I move a whole step down, it's going to move a whole step down, but it won't be this note. It'll be a whole step down. It really has to do with how you think about music. Honestly, my gut says go with the one where whatever note you press, that's the starting note of the sequence. It will screw you up, less you won't have to be thinking about what key you were in while you recorded it. So here's one I feel really strongly about. It's the forward, backwards, arpeggiation, repeat choice. So a lot of times, if you play 4 notes, it's going to go up, play the top note, and then immediately start coming down. When it gets to the bottom note, it immediately starts going up. If you pulled 4 notes down, it's going to fit perfectly in a 4-beat measure. The alternative is to turn forward, backward, repeat on, and you get there by doing D#2, F#1, and then turning it on with D0. And now, and you can, like if you only play 3 notes, Now we're in 4/4 with only 3 notes because you get an extra beat from that repeat. I just find it doesn't line up with my sequences as well. And so I just always on that one go with no repeat. Again, D sharp 2, F sharp 1, and then C0, and we're back to normal. Just the way I like it. Your mileage may vary. I'm guessing whichever one you pick, that's the one you're going to stick with. You can also do swing if you like to, but that's one you're going to have to do a lot because you're not going to be in swing most of the time. So you'll get used to that one on your own. Another couple of the newer ones, delayed keyboard octave shift, which strangely enough in version 1.2.3 is currently broken. They know about it. It'll be fixed for the next one. But it's, do you want to hold a low note by going down a couple octaves, then coming up a couple octaves and playing a different pitch while this one's still on the lower octave? Or when you hold the key, do you want even the notes you're holding down to change octaves? It's just a good way to play over a farther range, whether you're setting up an arpeggiation or a sequence or just kind of accompanying yourself when you're in Paraphony mode. That's one to play with, but it's broken at the moment. And another one is the round robin mode. And it basically says, every time I ask for an oscillator, do you want me to use the next oscillator? That allows you to change each oscillator to a different sound, so your arpeggiation is changing timbre as you're going through. Definitely experiment with that one. Then there's a couple other ones, paraphonic unison. These various unison ones have to do with if you hold multiple notes and then let some of them go, do you want the unused notes to jump and fatten up some of the other notes, or do you want them to just disappear? There's a stealing one. If you play too many notes and one of the notes gets lost, but you keep holding it and let go of the other notes, it will refill it. Those kind of things, you got to just try them and see how they work. And then at the end, there's various tuning scales, but if you're into alternate tuning scales, you're going to need to go down that rabbit hole all by yourself. But those are the basic global settings that once you get them and once you set them, you're going to just be so much happier with the keyboard behaving the way that you like. If you have any further questions about the Matriarch semi-modular synthesizer or any of the Moog line, please contact your Sweetwater sales engineer. My name is Daniel Fisher. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. For more videos like this, click here or go to sweetwater.com for all your music instrument and pro audio needs.